Hello, everybody. Welcome to tonight's Mosse-Lecture in the Senate Hall of Humboldt University. The subject of this summer term is Welt im Fluss, a title which can either be translated as river worlds or fluid worlds, and I'm tempted to add worlds in the state of inundation and liquidation. When we started to think about an adequate and timely topic for this semester's lecture series a year ago, we agreed that we wanted to draw attention to the important role of rivers as agent and patients in the economic world of our time. We had the climate change in mind and its impact on the global ecosystems, with the growing frequency of storms and devastating floods being only one consequence to worry about. None of us imagined that Vladimir Putin was at the same time making plans to reset the international agenda of geopolitical challenges and to invade Ukraine in order to revise the course of history. With the insufferable news of daily raids and bombings hitting Ukrainian cities and villages in the east and south, and with current threats directed towards Lithuania and other ex-members of the Soviet Union, a look on Russian imperial policies that ignores its most recent outcome is hardly possible, even if this is not at the center of tonight's talk. The area we are going to consider more closely lies within the Russian territory, and the power struggles revolving around that area date back to former centuries. Nonetheless, we know from the news that Vladimir Putin spent quite a while during the pandemic in self-isolation and surrounded only by a library of history books. Some of them must have dealt with the 18th century and the realm of Tsar Peter the Great. As we learned only a few days ago, he openly compared himself to the first Russian emperor, equating his attack on Ukraine today with Peter's expansion wars. And he admitted at the same time that his land grab is guided by our empire-building ambitions in line with those of Russian monarchs of long gone past. Since we are stunned by this presidential obsession with imperial history and Putin's ongoing abuse of that very same history to justify his army's war crimes, we are extremely happy to have Janet Hartley with us tonight. She's an expert of the history of the huge transformations that Russia went through within the last 3 centuries, and she will certainly be able to tell us more about the legacies of that history and the new legends manufactured around it. Janet Hartley is Professor Emerita of International History at the London School of Economics and Political Science, where she worked for over 30 years. She is the author of 7 books on Russian history in the 18th and early 19th centuries, not to mention the numerous volumes she has edited or co-edited on related topics. Among her monographs is a study on Russia as a rising military power and an accepted member of the so-called European concert at the beginning of the 19th century. Previous books of hers were dedicated to Emperor Alexander I, who ruled Russia during the period of the Napoleonic Wars, and to the social history of the Russian Empire from 1650 to 1825. Her most recent monographs resist the trend of producing global history panoramas by singling out instead specific regions, and in the case of Russia, approaching less-known multi-ethnic, multi-confessional areas with diverse social landscapes that were shaped both by voluntary and forced migration, by trade relations and economic exploitation. Her book on Siberia and the history of its people came out in 2014, and last year she released an extensive study on the Volga, named in its subtitle, A History of Russia's Greatest River. At the core of her interest is the Volga's role in the turbulent making of Russia, its importance as divider between East and West, but also as a contact zone, a place of commerce and cultural exchange, a backbone for Russia's imperial development, and a rich source of political myths. Her respondent and interlocutor on the stage of this theater will be Hans-Jürgen Balmes, whom we welcome as well. Hans-Jürgen Balmes is himself a knowledgeable informant about the individual history of mighty European rivers with special expertise of the Rhine. In terms of sheer length, the Rhine is less than half as long as the Volga. But in terms of traffic, it has become one of the busiest thoroughfares of the world, connecting the Netherlands, Germany, Switzerland, Austria, and France. In his biography of the Rhine, released in 2021, however, Hans-Jürgen Balmes is less concerned with the economic impact of the river than with its geography, its geology as an archive and memory of deep time, and with the biodiversity of beings he encountered while wandering and driving upstream towards the river delta. Animals like ants, bats, frogs, turtles, fish, beetles, and birds play a significant role in his very personal account of the river's history that his book unearths in the form of a travelogue. The book came out in the Fischer Verlag, a publishing house Hans-Jürgen Balmes is closely connected with since 1999. In his day job, if I may say so, he is responsible for the publisher's program of international literature and also co-editor of the Neue Rundschau, one of the oldest literary journals in the German-speaking world. Alongside edited volumes with short prose and poetry of authors like Bruce Chatwin and Michael Krüger, he has been responsible for numerous translations and especially devoted himself to the work of the British artist and writer John Berger. In his biography of the Rhine, his interest in art is palpable too, because he there regularly recurs to the paintings and sketches of William Turner. So tonight we will not only deal with two very different rivers, but also with two different perspectives upon them, two different approaches to their histories and their relevance as cultural and historical agents. After Janet Hartley's talk and Hans-Jürgen Balmes' response, we will have the opportunity to bring those two perspectives into dialogue. For now, please join me in welcoming once again Janet Hartley. The title of her talk is Taming the Volga. You see it there, Imperial Policies to Control Nature, People, and Beliefs. Janet, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. It's a great honor to be here to talk about the Volga. I'm not specifically going to talk about military history, but this is a lecture, in effect, about empire. The Volga is the longest river in Europe. At 3,530 kilometers, it's longer than the Danube or the Rhine, and it's simply one of the great rivers of the world. The conquests of the Khanates of Kazan and Astrakhan by Ivan IV in 1552 and 1556 gave Russia, Muscovy, control of the whole of the river Volga and extended its borders to the Caspian Sea. Why did the state need to control the river and the people who lived on its banks? And how was this attempted? This is the topic of this talk. I will focus on the policies of Imperial Russia, but I will also give some comparative examples from the earlier period and from Soviet and post-Soviet Russia. Firstly, why did the state need to control the river Volga? The answer lies in its economic and strategic importance, but also its vulnerability as a result of the multi-ethnic and multi-confessional composition of its population. The Volga was probably the most vital trade artery, and control of the river gave control over trade. Early states, Khazaria, Bulgar, from the 7th to the 13th century, grew wealthy from customs dues levied from traders on the river and built their capitals on the river so that they could control trade. Furs from northern Russia were immensely valuable and were traded for silver coins and weapons, which were transported up the river. Burial sites in North Russia and the Baltic have found silver coins from about AD 800. Caravans came across the Caspian and from the east to Astrakhan with silk, cloth, and spices. The conquest by Ivan of Kazan and Astrakhan was to secure this lucrative trade route, and the Volga continued to be of enormous economic importance. Silk, spices, and tea from China, Persia, and Central Asia traded through Astrakhan, and the cities of the Middle Volga, fish from the Caspian and the river, salt from the great salt pens at Lake Elton, south of Samara, grain from the Black Earth lands, mainly in Saratov and Samara provinces, tobacco grown by German colonists in Saratov province, of whom more later, timber from the north, later oil from Baku across the Caspian. Volga ports such as Samara, Saratov, and Nizhny Novgorod flourished on this trade. Nizhny Novgorod became the major fair in Russia in the second half of the 19th century, attracting traders from all over Europe and from the east. The port of Rybinsk, higher up the Volga, where goods were transported onto smaller ships to reach St. Petersburg and Moscow, was described in the mid-19th century as a complete forest of masts, and that the craft of various kinds are so numerous that a person may pass from vessel to vessel on planks from one bank to the other. In the 19th century, some 500 to 600,000 men, and some women, hauled the ships upstream and off sandbanks in backbreaking work. Steamships only slowly replaced barges for heavy goods. Railways began to take some of the freight and grain away from the Volga ports in the late 19th century. But industrialization also led to the development of several Volga towns as important manufacturing centers. Tsaritsyn, now Volgograd, was called the Russian Chicago and rapidly expanded as a center for metal industries, in part because of its position not only on the river, but also the rail routes. In the Soviet period, Volga towns were seen as the driving force of industrialization and economic progress. New manufacturing towns like Tolyatti were constructed on the River Volga to take advantage of the hydroelectric power and transport links. But the river also had to be controlled because of its vulnerability arising from the diversity of its inhabitants, especially on the Middle and Lower Volga. The conquest of Kazan and Astrakhan gave Ivan IV control of the whole of the River Volga. Russia, from this point, was a multi-confessional and multi-ethnic empire, with a ruler who claimed to rule over all Russia, to be the secular head of the Christian church in the east, but also to rule over predominantly Muslim Kazan and Astrakhan. Muslim Tatars were the largest minority on the Volga and in the Russian Empire in general, and in the Russian Federation today. Tatars were urban as well as rural. They were merchants and traders in Kazan and maintained a Tatar quarter in the city throughout the imperial period. It's now done up for tourists. There were other ethnic groups on the Volga, although unlike the Tatars, they were mostly rural inhabitants. Mordvins, mainly in Nizhny Novgorod, Mari, north of Kazan, both of Finno-Ugric origin. Chuvash, probably a Turkic people. Now the head of the capital of the Chuvash Republic is Cheboksary. Kazakhs and Kyrgyz in the lower Volga, who were Muslim. Kalmuks in the southern Volga, of Mongol origin and Buddhist, the only Buddhist outpost in Europe. Most of this population was rural or nomadic, but the Volga towns could be very mixed ethnically and confessionally. Astrakhan in particular was a multi-ethnic city in the 17th and 18th centuries, and to an extent thereafter. The town had distinct Armenian, Indian, Tatar and Persian quarters. It was said of the city at the end of the 17th century, there are diverse nations inhabiting here, drawn by the conveniency of trade and the sweetness of the air. The mixed ethnic, and in particular confessional, makeup of the population in the Middle and Lower Volga made the region potentially unstable and disloyal throughout the imperial period, and to an extent today. The result was that they had to be controlled. It's no coincidence that the first act of Ivan IV, when he conquered Kazan, was to lay the foundations of an Orthodox cathedral and expelled Tatars about 30 kilometers from the city. I will shortly discuss the policies to control non-Christians and the ways in which the Russian state attempted to Russify the region. But suspicions of a fifth column of disloyal, non-Russian and Muslim subjects were raised by Peter I in his Azov campaign against the Ottoman Empire and during the later Russo-Ottoman wars of the 18th and 19th century. In the First World War, both Muslim, Tartars and Christian, Catholic and Lutheran German settlers in Volga towns and villages were suspected of harbouring anti-Russian sentiments, although there is no evidence of this, and both Muslims and German colonists served in the Imperial Army. The tensions today between the government in Moscow and Tatarstan within the Russian Federation, which is rich in oil and asserting its Tatar Muslim identity, Tatarstan has its own flag and its own national anthem, is a continuation of this uneasy relationship. How did the Russian Empire exert control over this economically vital but potentially unstable territory? It's to this I'll now turn. Both Imperial Russia and the Soviet Union sought to control nature itself by controlling the Volga. The Volga may be the main artery for trade, but it's not easily navigable. This is Ulyanovsk, about south of Kazan, a picture taken. I took this picture early November, and it's part frozen. But it can be frozen for up to 6 months of the year, from late October through to March or early April. The spring could bring floods. The German botanist, Peter Simon Pallas, who became a professor at the Russian Academy of Sciences in St. Petersburg in the reign of Catherine II, took a scientific voyage down the river at the end of the 18th century and noted there had been floods of up to 12 metres in 1772, 1773 and 1798. But a greater problem for the Volga was the shallowness of the river, especially in the summer, and the number of sandbanks, many of which are shifting and hidden below the surface, and which is why so many boat haulers had to be used, mainly to pull boats off sandbanks. The river flows from north to south, from its source in the Valdai Hills between Moscow and St. Petersburg to the delta at Astrakhan, and from there into the Caspian. This resulted in two problems. First, the Caspian is an enclosed sea. Second, goods for the most part were exported south to north, destined for St. Petersburg and Moscow and Europe, whereas the river flows north to south, hence the additional need for boat haulers. Peter I was the first Tsar to attempt to control the river. He determined that the Volga should be linked to the oceans, the Baltic and the Black Sea, but also that its goods, and grain in particular, should be made available to his new capital, St. Petersburg, founded in 1703 during the Great Northern War. He commenced the canal structure, which took goods from the Volga to Rybinsk, through the Vyshny-Volochyok Canal System, through to the Ladoga Canal, and then to the Neva, the river in St. Petersburg. In the early 19th century, this was supplemented by two new canal systems. The canal system enabled St. Petersburg to be supplied and to grow into a major city. It also enabled goods to be exported to the rest of Europe from the port of St. Petersburg rather than having to be exported via Riga. The canal system linking the Volga with Moscow and the Black Sea via Rostov-on-Don was only completed in the Soviet period through the Moscow-Volga Canal, constructed in 1932-37, and the Volga-Don Canal, opened in 1952. It was a great propaganda coup to be able to say that the passage of the great river was now directed by the Soviet state. Indeed, it was said at the time to have brought the Volga waters to the Kremlin steps. At the same time, a massive network of dams and hydroelectric power stations was constructed between the 1930s and the 1970s, which were used to power new towns and industry along the Volga and throughout the Volga basin, the activities of which were determined by central planning in Moscow. The flow of the river is today fully controlled by dams and locks from just south of Tver in the north to south of Volgograd, but this has resulted in a slower flow and lower water levels, which can hinder shipping or prevent it altogether, and was disastrous for the ecology of the river. It was portrayed, however, at the time as the ultimate triumph of the Soviet state and Soviet engineers over nature and over the River Volga. This is epitomized by the enormous monument, Mother Volga, on the shore of the river near Rybinsk Reservoir and Power Station, constructed in 1953. The slogan on the base uses the words of Lenin: "Communism is Soviet power plus electrification of the country." The Volga had been tamed. One aspect, however, which has never been tamed, was infectious diseases, which followed trade and the movement of people on the river. The Black Death had devastated the Golden Horde in the 1360s and spread up the Volga from the south and was a significant cause of decline. Plague and cholera were carried up the river, primarily from the south and from Astrakhan, throughout the imperial period. In 1654, plague spread from Astrakhan up the river to Kazan and Nizhny Novgorod, and from there to Moscow and northern Russia. In 1727, plague occurred again in Astrakhan, possibly spread by soldiers returning from campaigns in Persia. The town was evacuated and all shipping was banned for 6 months. That is, drastic action was taken to try to control people and disease. But some 3,000 people perished. Astrakhan was a perfect breeding ground for disease. Traders met there, the city was crowded, water was either stagnant or polluted, and the climate was moist and warm. Further outbreaks of plague occurred in the Volga towns in the 18th and 19th century. In 1830, an outbreak of cholera in Astrakhan rapidly spread north to Saratov, Kazan, and Nizhny Novgorod. Kazan was described as a besieged town as the disease took home. The German colonies in Saratov province were ravaged by cholera that year. By the following year, the disease had reached Tver in the northern Volga and led to riots in the town in which the archbishop was slaughtered. A decade later, over 10,000 people died in Tver in a further outbreak. In the early 1890s, cholera again struck Volga towns, and its impact was so severe it led to famine. Government action, or inaction, to control the disease will sound all too familiar to us after our experience of COVID. The main policy of Imperial Russia was to restrict movement of people and goods. Shipping could be banned for short periods, but there was a reluctance to interrupt trade or the fair of Nizhny Novgorod when it was so valuable. The main policy was to set up cordons around infected areas, manned by soldiers, and to isolate whole quarters of towns which were particularly badly affected. The disease spread mostly in the summer and often weakened in the colder months. Russian physicians contributed to understanding the cause and spread of disease, but contemporary treatments, bleeding, opium, were less effective than isolation. Recognizing the role played by the river, ships were disinfected and special isolation cholera barracks set up on the shore, and there became an awareness of the importance of clean water. But I don't think the Volga was ever fully controlled in terms of disease. A further form of control by the government was to control the movement of people on the river, in effect deciding who should settle where and who should be moved away. The sometimes arbitrary movement of individuals and whole groups of people was a feature of both Imperial Russia and the USSR. Serfs, Cossacks, perceived enemies of the state. But the importance of the Volga made this area particularly susceptible to state intervention. It's the control of peoples on the Volga, which I'll now discuss. From the time of conquest of the Khanates, the Russian state had moved Russians into the middle and lower Volga, and in the process diluted the non-Russianness of the area. Ivan IV gave land to Russian servitors and to Orthodox monasteries. Both brought ethnic Russian peasants with them to settle the land. Abbots were regarded almost as officials of state, as they asserted the Orthodox ideology of the state and converted many non-Russian peasants to Orthodoxy. By 1719, some 500,000 ethnic Russian peasants had been settled in the Black Earth land of Saratov province alone. By the end of the 18th century, the majority of serfs in the middle and lower Volga were ethnically Russian. Serfs, though, were peasants settled on noble land. The majority of non-ethnic Russian peasants, Mari, Chuvash, Tatars, were not serfs but state peasants settled on land owned by the state. The Russian state also attempted to settle Russian soldiers on this land. In the 1730s and 1740s, retired, mostly peasant Russian soldiers were encouraged to settle in the so-called empty lands on the Volga, with a number of inducements, land and small payments per family member. The same offer was made to old soldiers in 1764 to settle in Astrakhan province. Perhaps not surprisingly, given the hardships of settling empty lands and the fact that retired soldiers were almost certainly maimed or declared unfit for service, few took up the offer. The town of Stavropol was founded in 1739, just west of Samara, on a bend of the river and the Volga, as a settlement for Kalmucks who had converted from Buddhism to Orthodoxy. The name Stavropol means City of the Cross. 2,000 Kalmucks were forcibly resettled there, but many Kalmucks joined Cossack revolts on the Volga in the 18th century, and the settlement became almost depopulated. The new industrial city of Togliatti was constructed on the site of this town. Catherine II took matters into her own hands by setting out to recruit German settlers to the Volga, mainly to Saratov province, but colonists were settled on both banks of the river. This actually is Sarepta. It's a large Moravian colony, and the reason it's preserved is it's within the territory of the town of Volgograd. I've been unable to find photographs of ordinary, you might call it, German villages, but the architecture is probably not so very different. Catherine intended the settlers to be farmers, on the assumption they would work diligently and provide a good example for Russian peasants. Indeed, they weren't allowed to pursue any other occupation in Russia, despite the fact that a good number of them had been recruited from poor artisans in towns. Some 30,000 German colonists arrived on the banks of the Volga in 1764. Many were settled on empty land with no housing, equipment, or food, and had to dig holes in the ground to survive the first winter. By 1768, there were 104 colonies on both sides of the river, Protestant and Catholic. By 1798, the number of colonists had grown to 39,000. By 1811 to 55,000, and by the First World War, their number was over 1 million. They had very large families, German colonists. The intention, however, to influence Russian peasants by their work ethic and sobriety was lessened by the fact that colonists lived quite separately from Russians, and indeed preserved all their old customs and language with little contact with Russians, at least until the conscription of Volga Germans was introduced in the 1870s. An English traveller in the middle of the 19th century noted that it was remarkable to see how little these colonists amalgamate with the Russians. They retain their own language, customs, and habits, and it must be added that the Russians also retain theirs. Neither the neater habits of the former, nor their ingenuity, nor their thriftiness seems to have had the slightest effect on the people with whom they dwell. They live as strangers amongst a strange people, he concluded. Catherine's aim was to increase the prosperity of the country, and the cameralist ideas of the time associated wealth with the size of population. Settlement, however, assumed the lands were indeed empty. In fact, they had been used by nomadic peoples whose way of life was eroded by grants of land to noble landowners, monasteries, and settlers. Kalmucks found, in their words, the banks of the Yaik and the Volga are now covered with Cossack settlements, and the northern borders of our steppes are inhabited by Germans. With the choice, in their view, between the burden of slavery or to leave Russia, they chose the latter. In 1771, some 150,000 Kalmucks from the lands between the Volga and the Don simply packed their tents and left for their ancestral homelands on the border with China. Some 100,000 perished on the journey. Catherine was furious. In the Soviet period, restriction of movement was imposed through the internal passport system and collective farms on the Volga and elsewhere. But whole groups of people were simply expelled from the Volga and resettled in Siberia or Kazakhstan if they survived the journey. This was true of kulaks, supposedly wealthy and exploitative peasants. The most brutal expulsion, however, was of the Volga Germans. This is despite the fact that the Volga Germans were the first ethnic group to be declared as an autonomous region in 1918, and their region was situated on the eastern bank of the Volga, with its capital opposite Saratov, called Pokrovsk, or Kossenstadt, renamed Engels in 1931, and was still retaining that name. It became home to Bosch and Henkel factories after the fall of communism. In 1941, Stalin deported the Volga Germans en masse to Siberia and Kazakhstan, condemned as spies and saboteurs. Some 600,000 Volga Germans had their goods confiscated and were packed into cattle trucks or freight trains with very little food and water. Those who survived the journey were obliged to work in construction or tree felling. Even after the rehabilitation of the Volga Germans by Khrushchev in 1964, they were not allowed to return to their Volga homes, although perhaps few would have wanted to, given the destruction of many of their villages and the impact of collectivization. Exile and immigration still required control of the people who remained. How did the Russian and Soviet governments control Russian and non-Russian peoples on the Volga? The river was itself a potential source of lawlessness. It was plagued by pirates and robber gangs until the 19th century, who could hide easily amongst the sandbanks, particularly at the great bend of the river, south of Samara. Adam Olearius, the secretary of the ambassador of the Duke of Holstein-Gottorp, travelled down the river in 1636 on a ship, in his words, that was equipped with all sorts of powder and missiles, metal, and some firing cannons, grenades, and other weapons, because of the fear of brigands, including Cossack pirates, who were, in his words, a barbarous and inhumane people, more cruel than lions, and the local Mari, who were a cruel, inhuman lot who loved pillage more than God. Cossacks could sail up the river, killing and robbing as they went, and there was no guarantee that the small garrison towns on the river would hold firm against them. The two great Cossack revolts of Stenka-Razin, 1667-70, and Emilian Pugachev, 1773-75 on the Volga, took years to subdue. Volga towns and villages were also subject to attack by nomadic Kyrgyz and Kalmucks. Armed force was one way of controlling the Volga towns. Oops. It's a replica, of course, but this is a replica of a fort in Ulyanovsk. Its original name was Simbirsk. Initially, these sort of forts were this, just a simple stockade surrounded by wooden ramparts and manned by a special group of soldiers, termed streltsy, normally translated into English as musketeers. In the early 17th century, Adam Olearius said of the Saratov that only streltsy lived there. The Volga forts remained important when the territory became more fully absorbed into the Russian Empire. At the beginning of his reign, Peter I demanded a survey of all the fortifications and cannons, shot and arms held in the Volga towns and settlements in order to assess his military capacity in this strategically important area in wake of his first Azov campaign. The musketeers were replaced by a regular army in Peter's reign, and garrisons continued to play an important part on the Volga in subduing local unrest throughout the imperial period. Their weaknesses, though, were exposed in the Cossack revolts of Razin and Pugachev, when soldiers in smaller forts went over to the rebels, and where garrisons could not prevent Razin from sacking Astrakhan and entering Saratov and Simbirsk, or Pugachev sacking Kazan, although the citadel stood firm, and Saratov. Cossack revolts were brutally suppressed. Not only were men executed and tortured to death, but whole villages were razed to the ground. The Volga Cossack host was abolished. But the Cossacks were tamed by having their independence restricted and by becoming incorporated into the regular army. By the 20th century, they were regarded no longer as rebels, but as the most loyal imperial troops who could be used to put down worker and peasant revolts. By the mid-19th century, threats to travellers and residents had been sufficiently reduced to allow for the flourishing of tourism on the Volga. The importance of military control over the River Volga was made particularly clear in the 20th century. Control of the river and its key towns was a crucial factor in the success of the Reds in the Civil War. For a short period, Samara was the base of the Komuch, the socialist revolutionary alternative government to the Bolsheviks. Had the white forces from Siberia and from the south managed to meet up on the Volga, then the outcome of the Civil War could have been very different. Control of the Volga was, of course, a crucial element in the Second World War. Both the German and the Soviet armies knew that control of the western bank of the Volga at Stalingrad would give the German army strategic control over the river, which is why neither side could give way. Although, as we shall see later, the River Volga gained an almost mythical status as well as a strategic one in the battle. But a lesser-known conflict on the upper Volga at Rzhev, a town of some 50,000 people on an important railway junction, was also strategically crucial to the outcome of the invasion in the northern sector. Imperial Russian control over the peoples on the Volga was not solely military, although it was often uniformed. The Volga was divided into provinces, and Russian governors and officials staffed the administrative offices. The form and language of government was Russian. The administrative structures were Russian. The law was Russian. The taxes and other dues were determined by a Russian government. The only exceptions to this were some low-level courts for non-Russians, Tartars in Kazan and so-called Asiatics in Astrakhan. But these courts only dealt with minor infringements or family matters, itself an indication that anything of a serious nature was handled by Russian law. By the 19th century, the garrison troops were supplemented by local officials and a police force, also predominantly Russian. In the Soviet period, government and legal systems were centralized, with little or no concessions to local practice. Force and all the administrative offices were used, firstly in an attempt to convert many non-Christians to Orthodoxy, some pagans, mostly Muslims, and second, to try to ensure that those converts did not reconvert to Islam. Monasteries initially played a part in the conversion of rural inhabitants, but from the 18th century, the pace and intensity of the conversion depended very much on the personality of the Tsar. In particular, Elizabeth, who ruled 1741 to 61, pursued an active policy of forced conversion and intensified missionary work amongst Chuvash, Mari, Mordvins, Udmurts and Tartars. There were incentives to convert, small privileges and exemptions from obligations, but pagan sacred and burial sites were also destroyed and mosques demolished if they were located near Orthodox churches. In the period 1740 to 62, 418 of the 536 mosques in Kazan province were destroyed. The remaining mosques were only spared because they had been built before the conquest of Kazan in 1552. Tartars were only allowed to build mosques if there were at least 200 male Muslims in a settlement. Catherine II and Alexander I were more tolerant of Muslims, and Catherine incorporated the Muslim elite into a special Muslim spiritual assembly. But the reign of Nicholas I was intensified missionary work, and the number of converts increased. The problem was that forced conversion, or conversion induced by trinkets or promises of exemptions from taxes, were often not genuine. It was common for pagan customs to coexist along Orthodoxy. The German botanist Johann Gottlieb Georgi travelled down the Volga in the 1770s and noted that the Chuvash only outwardly make profession of Christianity, and were more pagan than Christian, while the Mordvin had nominally been converted but were still attached to their ancient idolatry. Of greatly more concern to the Russian government, however, was that in the second half of the 19th century, there was evidence that some of the families of former Muslims who had converted to Orthodoxy in the 18th century were reconverting back to Islam. The full force, or at least paperwork, of the police and other Russian administrators, from junior clerks up to the governor, were involved in tracking down apostate families and even individuals and taking evidence from local inhabitants. Their fate could be harsh: expelled from their village, separated from other family members, including children. Some 1,200 converted Tartars who had reconverted to Islam were resettled from Chistopol district south of Kazan in 1843. The movement only intensified in the early 20th century. It has been estimated that 32,000 Christian Tartars in Kazan province converted to Islam between 1905 and 1910. In the Soviet period, of course, all people were persecuted for their religious beliefs, and most places of worship, Christian and Muslim, were closed down or at least heavily restricted. In addition to personal hardship and death, a vast amount of paperwork and time was spent identifying, trying and imprisoning any guilty individuals, dwarfing the assertion of the imperial regime with apostates. Force, armed force, and bureaucratic pressure could only achieve so much, be it moving people in and out of the Volga region and restricting their movements, suppressing revolts, or forcing conversion and resisting reconversions. To control the Volga completely, the Russian government needed to assert Russian cultural control, and it did so not only over the people who lived on the river, but by defining the cultural importance of the river itself, so that with the Russian sense of identity. So hot. Russian high culture became the predominant urban culture on the Volga. Russian theatre, opera, orchestral music, libraries, academic societies, museums, etc. The University of Kazan was founded in 1804 by Alexander I. I'm sorry, I'm going to have to sit down. I feel a bit faint with the heat. Kazan University was founded. Can I sit down and continue? Sorry about this. Kazan University was founded in 1804. It was a cultural centre for the whole of the Volga, published books in Arabic and Tatar, and became a cultural link between the East and West. But it was a Russian institution, established and maintained by the Russian government, which also determined its syllabus and policies towards rebellious students, including young Lenin. Popular culture was never fully Russified, and there could be crossovers between Tatar and Russian celebrations and customs. And it was only in the Soviet period that Soviet cinema and TV communicated a unified culture. Language was, and still is, a key factor here. High culture was transmitted in Russian, which was also the language of administration, law, the courts, and secondary and higher education. Non-Russian languages have been, and still are, used to assert non-Russian identity. The physical appearance of Volga towns also asserted Russian cultural dominance. The Kremlin was the physical manifestation of in-Russian imperial power, orthodox presence, combining as it did the garrison, the main administrative offices, and an Orthodox cathedral. But towns were also rebuilt in stone and expanded in the 18th and 19th century. The main buildings and streets were built in Russian European style. They were commercial and administrative centres of the Russian Empire, and not Tatar towns, let alone Chuvash or Mari towns. Architecture of public buildings and apartment blocks was standardised in the Soviet period. It's only in the post-Soviet period that an assertion of non-Russianness has appeared in Volga towns. Kazan is a good example. At one level, this can be seen as the tourist attraction of a Tatar restaurant complex. But at another level, it is this mosque here, the Khulsari Mosque, reputedly the largest in the Russian Federation, which can hold over 6,000 worshippers. Khulsari was a Muslim scholar who died alongside his students, defending the mosque against Ivan IV's forces in 1552. The mosque is built in the heart of the Kremlin, is higher than the Orthodox cathedral, and can be seen clearly from across the river. Tourists are guided from one to another, with no sense of the significance of erecting a mosque inside a Russian Kremlin. But not only the Volga people, but the river itself had to be culturally controlled and fashioned by the Russian state, and to an extent by the Soviet state. In 1767, Catherine made her first royal progress to her new realm and deliberately chose to travel down the Volga, in part to assert Russian control over the multi-ethnic towns like Kazan, where she visited the Muslim quarter of the town and was entertained in the governor's house with dances by Tatar, Chuvash, Mari and Mordvin peasants. The Volga enchanted Catherine. The river Volga is far better than the Neva, the river which flows through St. Petersburg, she wrote to her senior advisor, Nikita Panin. But the river also had to be tamed culturally to show that it, and by extension the whole region, was submissive to the empress. The poet Vasily Maikov wrote 2 odes on Catherine and the river Volga. The first ode was written in 1763, before the Volga voyage, when he described the river as flowing reluctantly south to the Caspian Sea, when it would rather be by Catherine's side. The river asked, "Why am I, the Volga, not allowed by fate to check my flow and be with you, O sovereign light of Russia?" In the second ode, written in 1767, the river Volga had in effect become the obedient subject of the empress, and by extension of the Russian state, and was so in awe of her that it had tamed the waters to ease her passage along its path. It, the river, marvelled in rapture, seeing Catherine's progress along it, and restrained its flow and stopped, and thus multiplied its swiftly flowing waters, with which, covering all the rocks and shoals, made for its sovereign lady a free passage. By the 19th century, the river had become a Russian river, which had a special place in the hearts of all Russians. The river was Mother Russia, a phrase used as far back as the end of the 17th century, but popularized in the 19th century. Of course, personification of the river is not unique to Russia or the Volga. But Mother Volga had a special role in protecting her children, the Russian people. The poem by Vasily Pushkin, uncle of Alexander Pushkin, written in 1812 when Russia was under threat from Napoleonic forces, makes this protective role clear. Take us under your protection, children of the Volga shores. The river also took on a sacralized Christian significance associated with Russia's unique history and orthodoxy. In 1793, a poem by Nikolai Karamzin characterized the river as the holiest in the world, the mother. Pyotr Vyazemsky's poem, Evening on the Volga, written in the early 19th century, declares, "Utterly fascinated, I love of an evening to listen, O great Volga, to the poetic sound of your holy waves. In them is heard Russia's ancient glory." In the late 19th century, the Volga was sacralized with a small chapel built over the source in an Orthodox church. The site fell into disrepair, but since the collapse of the Soviet Union, the chapel has been rebuilt in its original form, and the site has been blessed by two patriarchs of Moscow, marked by a plaque. In the Soviet period, the river inevitably was portrayed as special to all Soviet citizens and the defender against its external enemies. This is made clear in a crude way in the iconic song from the popular film Volga, Volga. Let our foes like ravening wolves leave their tracks at our country's borders. They shall not see our beautiful Volga, nor drink from the Volga's waters. The river's protective role was asserted even more strongly during the Battle of Stalingrad. The Volga was seen by both sides as a crucial barrier, not only in military terms, but also in cultural and psychological terms. And this, of course, is built in the 1960s, not at the time. I took this photo just to show the size of it and the people on top. The river was seen as a protective shield by the Soviet army. But the symbolism of the Mother Volga was so strong, as expressed in an essay on Stalingrad, written at the time. Stalingrad means the Volga. The meaning of the Volga for Russia cannot be overemphasized. There is no river like it in Europe. It cuts through Russia. The people have composed hundreds of songs devoted to Mother Volga. Would the Germans bathe their horses in the Volga, the great Russian river? Of course, this image of the great Russian river was not universally shared by the non-Russians on the Volga, who also saw the river as their own. As a Tatar journalist noted ruefully in 1990, Tatars have to get used to the fact that the Volga is a great Russian river. I'm going to conclude by suggesting there's another, perhaps more subtle reason for the determination to control the Volga and the people who live there. That is, the river was seen as a frontier, a dividing line, a barrier between Europe and Asia. I am in Asia, declared Catherine II in a letter to Voltaire when she reached Kazan in 1767. In fact, none of the Volga is in Asia. The border between European Russia and Asia, Siberia, is formed by the Ural Mountains to the east of the river. The border of Kazakhstan today runs northward up the Volga as far as Samara and is less than 100 kilometers in places. But this state did not exist in Imperial Russia. In any event, this is the part of Kazakhstan which is in Europe and not Asia. The Volga, unlike the Danube or the Rhine, crosses no international frontiers. Catherine's statement to Voltaire, of course, was a cultural one and not a geographical one, based on what must have seemed to her to be the exotic features and dress of the Tatars in Kazan. Yet there is a geographical divide, not in the north, which is Russian heartland, but certainly in the middle and lower Volga. The land to the west is hilly and relatively well cultivated and settled. That to the east is flat and more barren. Furthermore, settlements in the east were subjected to raids by nomadic and Muslim Kalmuks and Nogais. Those to the west were more settled and safer. Geography, safety, and culture combined in the popular perception. To the west was the settled, civilized European world. To the east were the wild steppes of Asia. This perception was certainly held by German settlers in the 1760s, and I think it's appropriate for this audience that I end this lecture with a reference to them. Those who were settled on the eastern bank, termed the meadow side, felt disadvantaged vis-à-vis settlers on the western bank, termed the mountain side, where the land was better and they were not threatened by raids, and where life was at least perceived as more secure and easier. So I'm going to end with the opening paragraph of the 2018 novel, My Children, by the contemporary Tatar writer Güzel Yakina, who expresses this divide through the eyes of a German colonist in the 19th century living on the eastern, the left bank. That's how the book starts. The Volga divided the world in two. The left, eastern bank was low and yellow and flat, stretching out into the steppe, from beyond which the sun rose every morning. The earth here was bitter to taste and dug up by gophers. The grass was dense and high, but the trees were stunted and sparse. The fields disappeared beyond the horizon, multicolored melons like a Bashkir's blanket. The villages clung along the water's edge. The wind blew hot and spicy from the steppe, from the Turkmen desert and the salty Caspian. What was it like on the other bank? No one knew. A cold wind always blew from the right bank, from over the mountains, from the distant North Sea. Thank you. Sorry, it's just so terribly hot up here. I thought I was going to faint.
Thank you so much. You've been very brave, very passionate about your river. One of the people of the Volga Deutschen who came there actually came from the Rhine, from Baden. And I presume that many of the Volga Deutschen also came from even far away along the Rhine. They came from Baden, from Zurich, from Basel, and they just founded villages with these kind of names. So we, in a way, have a preserved memory of where they came from in the names of their settlement. And Johann Philipp Speyer, he came without a wife. Presumably she died along the way. And so he arrived as a widower. He had 3 kids. And he received 2 horses, 4 cows, 25 rubles in silver, a coach, 24 pieces of rope, 1 triller, 1 scythe, 1 axe, 1 plow from metal, 300 big nails, 1 pot. And with this, he could manage to plow 2 hectares of the steppe. So 2 hectares is about like the size of 2 football fields. It's about the same kind of, these about 25,000 people left from around his valley. About 40 years ago, 25,000 people left the same landscape to go to America, to Carolina. So in a way, it was a bit like a settler thing. And I had to think hard, Janet, to understand the vast similarity and the vast differences between the Rhine and the Volga, because the Rhine, like most cities who have their mouth in the ocean, we perceive them from the mouth on. So we think about the Rhine and we go upstream, we go downstream, but we always have the whole voyage on our way. But with the Volga, it's an endemic, no, it's not that, sorry. It has no mouth in an ocean, so it ends in an interior lake. And in a way, this changes the character of the river completely. The Rhine has much more. It's much shorter, as we've heard, but it also starts with 2,400 meters and has 1,200 kilometers to go down into the sea. whereas the Volga started with 200 meters, and it has never the kind of speed and the kind of erosion. So the landscape of the rivers are completely different. But I was always thinking from the mouth of the Volga and couldn't really get it. I see that's a trade line. It was very early on, from the Middle Ages on, was a very important road, a conveyor belt. But it never had this kind of intricate culture with cities where the citizens were free in the Middle Ages, with the kind of, the Middle Rhine Valley was used for growing wine in the 13th century, that all these walls that we see now had been there in various other kind of incarnations in the same intensity since the 13th century on. So the Rhine was some kind of, even before the industrialization, it was a river of big industry and with a lot of different kind of citizenships. So like there are free citizens in the towns. The towns only had to report to the king. They didn't have to obey to a cloister or to a baron or to a count. But so the culture on this rivers were completely different, and the river Rhine could also be called the river of the book, because Gutenberg lived in the middle of the river, and Erasmus von Rotterdam, the greatest editor of all time, he was called Erasmus von Rotterdam, but most of the time he lived on the other side in Basel. So he could also be called Erasmus von Basel, and I'm sure that the Swiss want this. So the kind of paradigm between these rivers are completely different. For me, it occurred that the Volga was some kind of a conveyor belt to bring all the riches of this landscape up to the north. So there was a lot of grain, of course, to get, but it was always these precious things that have to be traded downriver, the silver coins against the spices and the silk and all the kind of wonders that came in with the Silk Road. The same is true for the Rhine, which was an important trade route, also between the north, of course, and the Upper Valley. And one of the earliest guys we know is the swordman from Stonehenge, because now we have the possibility to really see all the tiniest things that are placed between teeth. When they're just like archaeologists made some kind of exploration of the teeth of the swordman was found buried in Stonehenge, they found out that he must have been in the Alps because he had like little flowers there. And there was always this question, how could, in the Bronze time, bronze be produced in the Alps, because they didn't have the zinc that they needed to bring in from Cornwall. And this was must have been one of these men who did these travels, and these travels go back to 5,000, 6,000, 7,000 years before our time. So we have the trade tradition, but also we have at the Rhine a big tradition of local artistry. Let's say like we have a specialized product there, the Rhine wine, which was esteemed all over the world. But we also had the same notion that you had with the Volga, of a frontier. Much more to say, because the frontier of the Rhine was used as a wet frontier from the Roman Empire on. And this was a bit like a counter theme to the trade thing. The trade brought the people together. They had to work together. They had the same kind of procedures like changing into smaller ships where the rabbits are, to change back to the bigger ships when the rabbits are over. These things look similar, but this preciousness of the ships, the preciousness of the trade route was for the Rhine in some kind of imperative right from the beginning on, also to organize the ship traffic in a peaceful way. So in all the big kind of peace treaties, European peace treaties, from the 17th century on, there's always a provision provided for the Rhine and its ships. Like from the 30 Years War on, it's like in the Congress from Vienna, it's in the Treaty from Versailles. So every time we have a special provision for the Rhine, for the usage of the Rhine, so to make sure that it stays a free thing. So this kind of a multicultural, say like a multicultural situation that the Russians want to turn into a monoculture in their own culture, and to bring back people from the river so that they are more in control of everything. It's just like the counter story at the Rhine. Rhine, right from the beginning, was like as an important trade route, a melting pot. And it was actually the melting pot for the word was found. Of course, a melting pot with a lot of tensions. So all the Jewish pogroms that we had from the 8th century on, when the first Jews were reported to come, and they mostly come invited by bishops, who then lost control and couldn't protect them anymore. This was one of the darkest aspect of the history of the Rhine. But on the other side, I also understood that the Volga is so much vaster. So the piece or the territory that flows into the Volga is as big as France, Spain, and Portugal combined, whereas the same kind of area that waters into the Rhine is just like it's the northern part of Switzerland. It's the Vosges Mountains in France. It's about like 1/3 of the old Bundesrepublik. And of course, it's Belgium and the Netherlands. But this is, of course, a much, much more smaller territory. Still, what we had to we had this thing going on with the taming of the river. The taming of the river, for us, again, was something that was used to provide some kind of protection against floods. So that was the first reason why we had this massive kind of canal built from Basel to Mainz. And the second thing was then that when they started to build these dams, they found out it's very good for the ship traffic too, again. And again, at the same time, when the Prussians were trying to politicize the Rhine as a frontier against France, we already had started to have treaties with France about the building of dams and the building of these massive canalization of the Rhine. This canalization brought the same kind of biological catastrophe as at the Volga, with all these dams and hydropower stations, so that the migration of fish got cut down. And in a way, the Volga lost a bit like its kind of unique system, because as it has its own ocean where it flows in, It also had a lot of specialized species of fish, of fowl, and one of my new kind of favorite animal now is the water mole. It's a Russian deathman. It's actually a Wassermaulwurf. It's a bit larger than a regular mole and has a little like a long nose that can be mistaken for a trunk. So it looks like a small elephant, and he can use this snout or trunk as some kind of as a scuba diver with a snorkel. So this is a very cute animal, which is now quite endangered because of what's the same at the Rhine. It's, of course, a lot of industrial pollution going on. And his vast enemy is the nutria, the koipu, especially stupidly introduced animal from Latin America, which Humboldt was the first to make a description of this animal. So he was, in a way, the kind of guy who, in a way, brought us first knowledge about this Wasserschwein. And that's a capybara. But the nutria, unfortunately, is a bit like the kind of enemy, or became the kind of enemy of the water mole, because he uses the same kind of habitat, basically, and is much stronger and fiercer. Finally, I don't know if it's really funny, but it's fun in a way that in the Rhine was overrun a few years ago. Probably you have heard about the Schwarzmundgrundel. That's the round crop. And this is a small fish of no use as something to eat or to pull out of the river. And the small fish came into the river from the Black Sea through the canals that we connected the Rhine with the Danube. So it was following the Danube and go up. Now we also find this fish in the Volga, because also the Volga was, maybe with the effort of our grandfathers, connected with the canal from the Volga to the Don. The Don, you know, goes into the Black Sea. So this is it's a funny thing that connects the rivers again. Like first it was the people who came from the Rhine and moved to the Volga region, just to be driven away from their home, their new home again. And lately we have a fish in common with the Volga, who is not the sturgeon, which I think will never return to the Rhine and is very endangered at the Volga too. But we have this fish, the round copper. On the other side, I'm still dreamy about the Volga, because it disappears into the Caspian Sea. It provides about 80% of the water flowing into the Caspian Sea. That's a lot, but it's not enough to keep the sea in water. So every year it loses about, like, I don't think, like it's about, they say in a few years, 1/4 of the river of the sea will be dry land. In a way, it has a long kind of effect, as we have it with the Aralsee, which is nearly vanished. But because of that, on the other side, the Volga has some kind of a metaphysical thing. Maybe you remember the novel The Tartarian Desert from Buzzati, and when I was reading about the Volga, I was always thinking about this novel, which just like fades out into the plains of Asia, and all this kind of massiveness, all the power, all this way that he wants to create a new kind of reality disappears into the fog. Thank you so much. That was try to answer to this very marvelous speech, which is so much full of detail. So every time I read a page of yours, I was making notes, and I thought, no, it will be a book as big as the book about the Rhine. That's of no use here. Thank you so much.
Now I think the microphone's on, yes. Thank you so much for your talk, Janet, and for your response, Hans-Jürgen Balmes. And let me express, first of all, my full admiration for the good stamina you've proven here in this hall. I really have to apologize that the invitation is combined with such a stressful physical exercise for both of you. And also a second apology because I omitted one translation of the title of our lecture series, Welt im Fluss. I should have added World in Dissolution, because that's the state where we're at. I'm very sorry, Hans-Jürgen, that I cannot contribute anything to the story of biodiversity and the list of endangered species you presented to us, which is all the more sad because we share the fact that we grew up on the riverside of the Rhine. And I have to admit, when I was young, when I was 4 years old, I only had eyes for the ship. So, no, not for the water mole. I didn't even know that this existed, but for the ship. Let me take up one idea that you already had to discuss, the similarities and the differences between the Rhine and the Volga, because you mentioned that in contrast to the Rhine, the Volga is a river that starts somewhere in the north and leads to an enclosed sea, which doesn't seem, from a geopolitical or geostrategic point of view, seem very interesting. And you mentioned as well, I mean, you insisted on this myth of Mother Volga and the fact that it has been elevated to kind of Mother of Russia. And on the other hand, you told us a story that this motherhood is totally unlikely, right? Because what we heard of was the fact that both the river resisted to this control exerted by the Russians by its natural preconditions. You mentioned the fact that the river is frozen for 5 or 6 months. It's basically half a year, right? And then you mentioned the shallowness of the river. So you, in economic terms, it doesn't seem to be very interesting to try to control this river. And on the other hand, you mentioned the multi-ethnic and multi-confessional population, and you used expressions like disloyalty, instability, uncertainty of the territory. So this was, too, the most unlikely region to be something like the origin of Russia, and nonetheless it became so important.
Can I?
Yeah.
I think, yes, it starts somewhere insignificant and it flows into an enclosed sea. It was the canal building which took the Volga to the Baltic. And of course, the reason for that was Peter I founded St. Petersburg on the Baltic, but with no hinterland that could supply the city, and nothing which could grow grain. So the whole existence of St. Petersburg was dependent on grain and other goods reaching it from the Volga. And that's why the canal structure was so important. So in that respect, I mean, it is important for that reason. It supplies St. Petersburg in particular, and it means that goods can be exported from St. Petersburg rather than Riga. Even before the Moscow-Volga canal, which never worked terribly well because it was never deep enough, there was a structure that also took things to Moscow. But Moscow didn't need it quite so much because Moscow had got an economic hinterland. St. Petersburg didn't. It was a completely artificial creation. And you then had to supply it, and then it became a great port. On the Mother Volga, well, I think it's because it's not entirely Russian. that it becomes so important for it to be Russia. Because you almost have to say as a Tatar child in school, this is a Russian river. You have to assert the Russianness over many people who are not ethnically Russian, particularly in the middle and lower Volga, of course, not so much in the north, but even in the north, there are pockets of people who are not Russian. So I think it's for that reason. And then there is a sense of just its breadth. It is a barrier. And so I suppose in that respect, that sort of protective element is there. I mean, I can think of many rivers which have been sacralized, many rivers which have been personified, Old Father Thames, Old Man River, Don Ivanovich, the River Don in Russia. But I can't think of any other that's used quite in this sort of sense of protection. And I think it's a sense of, Russia is so, it's got such a great landmass that's an ultimate barrier. Even if you get that far, you're never going to get any further because of the river. And so I think that sense of protecting us, Mother Russia, is unique to the size of the Volga.
Yes, you mentioned the huge landmass of Russia. I remember the first flight from Europe to Japan, where I was totally astonished that already flying over Siberia took 10 hours. It was incredible. And this leads me to the question, the bulk of Russia or the bulk of that landmass is totally excluded from this myth, right? Because the barrier you mentioned is a barrier within Russia dividing the western part from the eastern part, and the story you told us was totally concentrated on the western part.
I think that's true, it is true, but does that matter? I mean, we've got enormous mythology in the United Kingdom about the Queen and the royal family, but most people haven't met them, haven't had tea with the Queen or with Paddington. So, I mean, I'm not sure you can have a mythology of something without actually being on the river. Maybe it's even stronger if you're not on the river. The Volga did become very important for tourism in the late 19th century, and tourist guides of the late 19th century projected it very much as a pride in Russia, something special. I suppose, too, one aspect I didn't really have time to develop was the sensitivity of Russian artists and Russian writers about Russia generally in the mid-19th century. Was it really part of European Romanticism? Had it got anything beautiful there? The beautiful things they saw in Italy and Greece. And they had to sort of rediscover themselves the beauty of the Volga, to sort of compare it with other countries. They had to find ancient ruins, which were Bulgar ruins. So I think it's part of that assertion that we're not second best, we're equal. In fact, it's even better. The Volga is even bigger than anywhere else. And I think that could resonate with people who don't live on the Volga.
I mean, another thing that struck me is if this emphasis on the frontier between the rich West and the poor East, to put it in very rude terms, is so strong and also compelling for people that have been colonized by the Russians, basically, right? This narrative is very much at odds with the West-East divide we have now in philosophies like people for Alexander Gudin and so on and so forth. Would you like to comment upon that? I mean, you resisted, I felt that at the beginning of your talk, to extend your story to the Russia of today, but...
Well, I was writing about the Volga. I wasn't writing about contemporary Russian politics. I mean, the book was written, of course, before the invasion of Ukraine. I was writing about empire, how you control an empire, what's successful and what isn't successful. You know, military power can be quite successful. It was in Russia, it was in the British Empire, it was in the Turkish Empire. So up to an extent, that's the easiest thing, if you like. It's much more difficult to, and actually the cultural power, I think they did it pretty successfully, given, despite the problems that you rightly suggest. It's the hearts and minds. It's almost making people pretend that they're Russian and Orthodox rather than Tatar and Muslim, and accept that subordinate status within an Orthodox country. That they didn't achieve, and that just tormented them. So I guess I was looking at, you know, what dominates this empire, this near empire. You know, it's not Siberian, a far empire. It's a near empire within Europe. And it is the conversion and the reconversion. So I think there was that. And the other thing I looked at, which I think, we as Russian historians don't look at, we tend to use the shorthand Russia for areas which are not Russian, in the way that people use England instead of Britain or United Kingdom. And I wanted to look at those groups and to look at how they related to each other. So, for example, the Volga Germans, there's a lot been written on the Volga Germans, but very little has been written on the Volga Germans and how they integrated into Russian society, which they only really did after conscription. A lot have been written on Tartars, the type of stoves they had, the type of food they had, but not on what the crossover was. So I was trying to do that as well. I think, thinking about Ukraine, the whole situation is very, very different. But there is a sense of empire, a former empire, of harking back to empire, recreating an empire, an assumption of various territories being subordinate to other territories, an idea that countries didn't have a history. Russia had a history. I mean, so did Khazars and Bulgars, but the idea, Chuvash, Tartars didn't have a history. So you create your history for them. You assert Russianness in all sorts of ways, culturally and politically, to at the same time degrade the present culture. So there's no sense of sort of Tartar-style buildings in towns. Towns are sophisticated and civilized, European and Russian. So I think there are some very broad imperial considerations that are relevant.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking at, that the Russia you presented to us is, in fact, a European one, right? Also in its self-perception. And this is striking, because this is totally at odds with the narratives we hear today.
I don't know about that. I mean, now we are getting into contemporary politics. I think when events happened in the Ukraine, people like me, literature specialists as well of the 18th and 19th century, we have actually assumed that Russia is European. We know that it's behind the West in certain ways, that it was a lot of literature and art and was derivative, or ballet, or what have you, and political systems, political thought. But we did genuinely feel that it was part of a European movement, at least for the 18th century, in terms of Enlightenment, Romanticism, Marxism. And I think we all knew there were various elements in that Russian story which had quite fundamental flaws and weaknesses. And I'm not sure that we really highlighted them, perhaps in the way that we should as historians. And if I sort of illustrate those, I think three ways. Well, one is the relationship between church and state, which really was, the church was an organ of the state from the time of Peter the Great, for the time when Peter insisted that priests had to break the seal of confessional if there was something anti-state, and more or less made the Holy Synod a department of state. There's been very little moral or intellectual resistance to the state. And I think that's different. I think the second difference is censorship. I tried to work out once when it was that Russia didn't have censorship. And I'm not sure. It didn't have censorship when the Soviet Union collapsed for a few years, but in most of the imperial period and most of the recent period, it's had censorship. And the third thing, the most difficult thing in a way, is the rule of law. When did Russia have the rule of law as we understand it? I think it did from about the mid-1860s to the mid-1880s. I don't think it really did before then. It certainly didn't in the Soviet Union, because law was subordinate to the party, and I don't think it has now. So I think maybe we also have to reassess historically, not just the sort of the contemporary situation, but have we in some way exaggerated the cultural links, which are clearly there, the cultural links, and downplayed possibly some of the other ones? I'm just not sure. But I think it's something that in time historians will also have to address.
I mean, getting back to the things you were interested in your talk related to the multi-confessional area that you presented to us, I missed one group that you were bringing in, referring to the Rhine, and those were the Jews. Didn't they play a role at the Volga? And could you, Hans-Jürgen, expand a little bit in which sense they were important for the Rhine and the migration movements?
The Jewish settlements in Speyer, Mainz, for example, and Worms created this very famous pinnacle of Jewish culture in the Middle Ages. And the Jews came Sephardic Jews. They were invited by the bishop. They settled in the cities, and if you ever visit Worms or Speyer, you can see the mikveh, which have been restored both, and wonderful buildings, which is some kind of ritual cleaning bath for the Jewish community. And this mikveh was more important for a community than the actual house to pray in. So these buildings were built first, and both of these buildings and others that were destroyed were done by the same kind of masons who just built the cathedral next door. So it was just like Christian workers who built these things, and that must have been a short moment of peace between these people when this happened. But the plague came. We had some kind of a climate change in the 13th century, which made growing wine very difficult. So they had very uneven harvest. So suddenly many people had depth with Jewish people, and this was also one of the main reasons the bishop brought them in, because they wanted to have them for the kind of skills with money. And when this happened, a bad year for the grapes, it usually ended in a pogrom. And that there were very, very violent, furious ones right at the Rhine. There were other parts of the country where the kind of problems with the grapes were not so essential. So there was always some kind of a forced immigration in between a certain area. And one of these areas is a bit north of Frankfurt. It's in Friedberg, where the mikvahs in Worms and Speyer are Romanic, but the one in Friedberg is already Gothic. And it's a bit like, it's a wonderful building, everybody should see this. It's a bit like a church tower digged into the ground, because the water in the mikveh no man should have touched it. So they dig their way down to the ground level where the groundwater came in. So at Worms and Speyer, so it was against the Rhine who was pressing up through this structure. And in Friedberg, they had to go 20 meters through solid rock to found this. This is amazing. And just to sit in this mikveh, to imagine the kind of toil, and also to imagine the kind of horror that was placed in there when the Jewish people fled into their mikveh to shield themselves during pogroms, is very nerve-wracking. So we had this Jewish communities coming and going over the centuries, but one of the most astonishing stories that I got to know when I was researching the book was that in the Second World War, some Jews still could survive the Nazi time. There was one woman, Cherry, who lived in a town close to Mainz, and she survived it all. She survived the repression of the Nazis, and then she was shot about like 15 minutes before the American army was already coming on the other side of the Rhine. They're just like you could hear them. They were shot in this moment, and this for me was a bit like a sign for the kind of relentless atmosphere that is between these two groups, could turn everything over in a second. So Jewish culture always have been a big dimension on the Rhine, very important. It was a bit like the Jerusalem of the Middle Ages, these two cities together, with all these famous rabbis teaching there, the important books being written there. But on the other side, in the 20th century, the job was done nearly to erase everything. And if you ever have the chance to go to Cologne and see the Citizen Hall, and in front of the Citizen Hall have been the Jewish center of the city, and everything is broken. Not only broken, but it's broken. So there's not even one piece that they could reconstruct as a whole thing, but they had to it's the puzzle of the most tiny pieces.
Yeah, I don't think it's the same for the Volga. Russia acquired most of its Jewish population after the partitions of Poland in the late 18th century, in Poland and in Lithuania. And they were, for the most part, confined to what was known as the Pale of Settlement, which was that part of Western Russia. They were allowed to go to Odessa, which is why Odessa became such a multi-ethnic and vibrant city. Every so often, the Tsars relented and decided that bringing Jews inland was a good thing because it would stimulate trade and industry. And I did find reference to Jews in Volga towns, but really not that many. Certainly, I don't think seen as a threat. I didn't come across, well, the only pogroms I came across were in the northern Volga towns, where there were pogroms against Jews, but not in the middle of the lower Volga towns. And those pogroms were linked with the revolution. So I don't think it was as much of an issue. And I did look at a couple of lists of occupations of Jews in Volga towns, and they were mostly of the artisan nature. They weren't, superior to that. So the Tsarist government did list the number of Jews, did want to know how many Jews there were in towns and what they did, which is why I can see these lists. Thank heavens for bureaucracy, for historians. But I don't think they were ever seen as the same sort of threat as converted Muslims reconverting back to Islam. And that was really seen as a threat. And not without justification, actually.
And you mentioned also that this was a really feared source of resistance. And I wondered what happened to this resistance now, if you say the threat of reconversion to Islam was real.
Well, they have a large Muslim population on the Volga, and Tatarstan is an interesting example because it's wealthy, it's got oil, it's asserting its Muslim credentials, but it's doing so deliberately in a very conciliatory way, in a very open way to Christians. How that works in practice, I'm not quite sure, but they do things like, wherever they build a mosque, they also build a church, if it's in a new housing estate. And they've managed to project themselves as moderate Islam, as opposed to Islam in, say, Dagestan. So provided they can sort of hold that balance, then I think it's okay. And certainly, when I was in Kazan, which I've been several times, I had Muslim friends who were really very secular, but they identified as Muslims. They were horrified to find out that at the London School of Economics, for example, we don't teach at various points in Jewish and Muslim festivals. They saw things in a much more secular way than we did. So I think if they can project themselves in that way, that's fine. But of course, it only takes one incident, one awful terrorist incident to change that sort of dialogue. And so far, it hasn't really happened in Kazan, that there was one attack in Volgograd. So I think it's a tricky situation for Russia. I mean, I'm not sure. I mean, I've read a little bit about Tatarstan since the invasion of Ukraine. And I've got quite a lot of friends in Kazan, but they're not really able to write to me freely. I think Tatarstan's rather resentful of it. They're doing well. What do they want to be involved in this struggle for, you know, of brother Slavs, whatever you like to call them. So I don't know, there's a potential trickiness there in the Russian Federation of what do you do with all the people who don't share this sort of corrupted view of sort of Russian orthodoxy and Russian ideology.
And do they have different information, or do they listen to you? Because we hear about many people who, even from their relatives living in Ukraine, tell them not to yield to Western propaganda and so on and so on.
Well, the people, actually, I quoted right at the end this Tatar writer, Guria Yakimna, and she wrote something very brave, I think, for Moscow Times, which is an English language publication. I think it's based in the Netherlands, but it has a lot of information about Russia, about her shock at the war. Because she said that she'd been brought up, she's a bit younger than me, but she'd been brought up to think that the whole of the Soviet Union believed in peace. That's what it was all about. You had peace days. As Komsomol, you went out and you had peace days. And it was just a shock to the system. She was shocked, she was horrified, and she said, "It is not my war." Now, she wrote that in Moscow Times. I mean, she's quite a prominent figure. Perhaps that makes her safe. But you know, of course, the people I know are not the norm. They're people who are cosmopolitan. Many of them speak English. They still somehow seem to have access to other sources of information. But they're the tiny minority.
I look into the hall because we don't want to exclude you from our discussion, and feel free to ask the questions you have to both of my interlocutors. Yes, please. Denise, behind you, right behind you.
Yes, thank you for the very interesting talk. My question would be about the cultural appropriation of the river, or the cultural taming. You were saying that the river was written into the poems of one writer, and I was wondering how was the river first brought into the consciousness of Russians living very far away of the river itself? Was it with these poems, or were there other methods that were popular at the times?
Well, it's a good question, because these were formal odes written to Catherine. So actually, that's really for the consumption of the court, rather than any ordinary people in any part of Russia. But by the time you come to the 19th century, then I think the type of poems I was talking about do get known to the literate classes, the chattering classes, at least. And you know, in 40 minutes, I couldn't cover all the things that I covered in the book. There are other literary references to the Volga, and people like Chekhov, Ostrovsky. So they do become known. And there are also the visual arts as well, the paintings of the Volga, the beauty of the Volga, Repin and the boat haulers, all those things, which depicts another side of it, the sort of suffering of the Russian people despite the beauty of the river, if you like. But they will become known to the intellectual classes through that. Now, I think if you're asking me, you know, when does the common man become really aware of the Volga? Well, tourism is something, of course, but that's really the merchant class. Paintings are really the merchant and the noble class. But films aren't. And that film, Volga, Volga, gets through to everybody. And I remember reading an account from Yaroslav, which is on the Volga, in the northern part of the Volga, written during the Second World War, saying that the bombs were falling down, they were being attacked, and they consoled themselves by watching Volga, Volga, the film, because it was written before the war, of course. Now, you know, that's somebody writing in a provincial town. And so I think, you know, by that stage, by cinema, then you can depict that view of the river, and it can get into popular consciousness. And the song was very popular, the singer who sang it was very popular, stamps of the Volga. So I think people did know about the Volga elsewhere. Even if they hadn't seen it, they knew about it. I was also struck when I went up the Volga that, I mean, I went on a cruise, first of all, up from Astrakhan to Nizhny Novgorod, but then I went back and visited a couple of places which I hadn't visited before. So I visited Ulyanovsk, which is Simbirsk, Tver in the north. And the first thing the taxi driver says is, "Have you seen the river?" Well, you know, I live in London now, but I don't normally say, "Have you seen the Thames?" And I was born and brought up in Manchester, and I bet nobody here knows what the river is in Manchester. So, you know, it just seemed a very different sort of focus from the way that it would be that I was used to. So the river did mean something to people.
I mean, you mentioned when we talked earlier that this book on the Volga was the one, the most successful in a way you wrote, and you said that with a sense of disappointment.
The disappointment, I suppose a little bit of academic irony. I think the best book I ever wrote was a biography of somebody called Charles Whitworth, who was a second-ranking diplomat who happened to be in Russia at the time of Peter the Great and saw Russia become a great power, and or partly a great power. And you know, it's a sort of very specialized diplomatic history book that some people have read, but most people would never have heard of. And there's a sort of irony that was a very detailed archive study, and this has been more popular. And actually, I'm surprised myself because it came out during lockdown, and it came out in January, which is the worst month for a book to be published. It's much better the run up to Christmas when people are desperately thinking what to buy for their relatives. And I don't know whether, I think people read more books, took more interest, so maybe there's an element of fluke in it as well. But, I mean, for me, you know, I'm at the end of my academic career, I did feel, after having written a lot of specialized books, that I had to teach Russian history right from the earlier period through the Soviet period. I never taught the post-Soviet period, but I taught the Soviet period simply because if you were doing what in Britain is a sort of marginal country as opposed to Britain or France or Germany, you just had to push yourself so much wider. And I thought, well, you know, why shouldn't I, in a book, talk about the sort of things that I've talked about with the students, and the sort of things that puzzle me about Russia, and puzzle them about Russia, but do it within the context of a region or a river. And I think that that's why I settled on it. But I did have to have a cruise up there after I stepped down as head of department to convince me that I could do it.
I mean, comparing the two books that you wrote on two different rivers, what struck me was also I mentioned that earlier, the approach to history, because when one reads your book, you get a sense of that rivers take you to a kind of pre-history, right? Which extends your horizon into dimensions where human history is totally out of sight. I mean, the glacier epoch plays an important role in the story you tell. And I think also this total shift of perspective it also explains why you're interested in this biodiversity of insects. And I mean, I even learned that dinosaurs and crocodiles have lived in the Rhine, and you found traces and so on.
Yeah, contrary to the Volga, is the Rhine or the formation of some parts of the river valley goes back right to the time when Europe as a continent was being formed. So it's very early. And if you go to the Grube Messel, which is near Darmstadt, where these famous early mammals were preserved in the shoal, you have a window on how the world actually looked like when this river broke in and built up this valley. And when I saw this, I thought, okay, the story of the Rhine starts in the middle, he grows backwards, he goes towards the sea. The sea wasn't already there when it started to build this kind of formation. I found this very very, I would say, like astonishing, and it was this kind of astonishment which made me curious to see for more of this kind of geological information. But on the other side, it's not something like a dumb cinema where one picture falls into the next one. As Darwin said, and he really was a prophet with this, that between the different kind of stages of geological parts that we see, there are vast rooms of blackness where we can see nothing. So there are long, he called it geological pauses, where we don't know anything. But this was the one thing, this Grube Messe, which is like was a volcano crater, and then it was like a sea where all the mammals are sunk in because the water was poisoned. And on the other side, I found the same kind of structure right at the mouth of the river. In this time, the crater was man-made, and it's used as a toxic waste dump, and where all the toxic residue of the harbor of Rotterdam that can't be put into the North Sea because it's too toxic, had to be preserved. And then I had these two kind of craters, the one man-made and the old one, the one who gave me a window to the past, and the new one who actually embodies something of the future of the Rhine as a river that we have to preserve from ourselves, from our toxic waste in this space. So this kind of two craters gave me then the courage to say, okay, now we have to do the whole river.
I was wondering in which sense your approach to the Rhine was also kind of reflection on the recent discussion about the Anthropocene and the erasure of the barrier between natural history and human history. Because your history is one of seizure of control, cultural, as you named it, cultural appropriation. Yours is one of the destruction, the pollution of the river, the channeling,
Still, I hope is also a book about the chance that we still have. So it's I would say it's a bit alarmistic, but I think it's not too much because I see that if nature has had so much patience with us till now, maybe the nature's patience is large enough so that we have a close escape, but it's very close.
I'm not sure if we can count on this. I look into the audience because it's close. Oh, it's even after 9 o'clock, and I assume that my interlocutors are pretty exhausted. Nonetheless, you shall have a final chance to ask questions you still have. This doesn't seem to be the case. Then I say thank you with a big recommendation for both books that you wrote. Thank you for being here. Thanks for sharing your thoughts with us. And I end with switching to German and weise Sie gerne hin darauf, dass die nächste und letzte Mosse-Lecture in diesem Semester schon am kommenden Donnerstag stattfindet. Dann wird Norbert Scheuer hier sein. Norbert Scheuer, den Sie kennen als Autor aus der Eifel, auch als Autor über die Eifel, der im letzten Jahr in der Presse auch deshalb präsent war, weil er die Hochwasser, die Flutkatastrophen, die Ahr heimsuchten, sehr ausführlich auch publizistisch begleitet hat. Das wird auch sein Thema in der kommenden Woche sein. Kleine Flüsse, große Fluten, Szenen vom Hochwasser in der Eifel. Wir freuen uns, wenn Sie dann wieder dabei sind. Es wird am Nachmittag auch einen Workshop geben, gemeinsam mit Lothar Müller und Tobias Krüger. Die Interessierte führen an Berliner Flüsse, die Panke und Gespräch. Ich habe mir sagen lassen, dass der Andrang hier schon sehr groß ist, sodass Sie sich drängeln müssten, um da noch ein Ticket zu bekommen. Aber umso mehr freuen wir uns, wenn Sie dann Interesse haben, auch abends sich hier im Senatssaal einzufinden. Damit verabschiede ich mich von heute, wünsche Ihnen noch einen guten Abend. Bis zum nächsten Mal. Dankeschön.